Let's get started. Hello everyone. I'm Rodrik, Gordon Hanson. So the idea is that I'm going to be speaking for about 20 minutes, possibly less, and then turn it over to Gordon, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussions in the last 20 minutes of an hour. By way of background, Gordon and I are co-directing a program here at the Kennedy School called the Reimagining the Economy program that has this very august title, but it's really focused on understanding precisely how industrial policies and place-based policies can produce more inclusive society. Let's get started. Hello everyone. I'm Rodrik, Gordon Hanson. So the idea is that I'm going to be speaking for about 20 minutes, possibly less, and then turn it over to Gordon, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussions in the last 20 minutes of an hour. By way of background, Gordon and I are co-directing a program here at the Kennedy School called the Reimagining the Economy program that has this very august title, but it's really focused on understanding precisely how industrial policies and place-based policies can produce more inclusive societies and produce both more productive economies, but also economies where more people have access to these productive employment opportunities. As Gordon is going to describe, essentially our lab is the vast variety of local economic development and place-based experiments that actually takes place within the United States that has often remained under the radar screen of those who think about issues like industrial policy. But we're trying to integrate sort of the broad global discussion on industrial policy with the actual experience and knowledge that one can get from the local economic development policies that characterize the United States. So I'm going to start by just saying a few things about sort of where we are in terms of our knowledge on industrial policy, talking about some of the conceptual work in this area. I don't need to tell you that industrial policy is on the rise. You can actually even see it in various quantifications of the use of industrial policy. This chart actually comes from the work of Rekha Juhas and Nathan Lane, with whom I recently co-authored a paper for the annual review of economics. But that sort of looks at the incidence of industrial policy, and it's risen significantly, and actually its rise predates Biden and Trump. And one of the interesting things that we find is that industrial policy has been always quite prevalent in the advanced countries as well as in the developing countries. And I like to point out that even in the most conservative, under the most conservative governments like Reagan's in the US, or Thatcher's in the UK, or even under Pinochet in Chile, there was actually significant use of industrial policy. Of course, the big difference now is that in the United States, increasingly in Europe as well, industrial policy is being carried out in a very in a way that's is very open about the use of industrial policy, no longer under the radar screen, no longer, we don't really do this. In fact, it's sort of, we're explicitly doing this, and here's our industrial policy. And that, of course, puts the debate in the industrial policy for developing countries in a kind of a dilemma. On the one hand, for developing countries that have always been more prone to use the industrial policies, they say, our ideas are in some sense vindicated. On the other hand, developing countries don't like advanced countries doing industrial policy because they worry that that might turn into protectionism and might actually close markets for them. So what is industrial policy? I think it's useful to have a definition out. I think of industrial policy as any government policy that explicitly targets the transformation of the structure of economic activity in pursuit of some stated public policy goal. So think about this as a kind of a policy that has the form, we promote X, where X could be a particular sector, a set of firms, a region, a particular technology, and also sort of the implicitly, the unstated part of the policy, therefore implicitly not Y. Okay, industrial policy is not going to state what Y is, but of course in general equilibrium, if you're promoting some things, you're disadvantaging some other things. Now, the traditional focus on industrial policy has been on sort of manufacturing, high-tech sectors, but of course it doesn't need to be. When you think about industrial policy in this form, it could be any kind of policy that's sort of partial to some segments of the economy. We're seeing this increasingly, for example, in the deployment of of industrial policies in service of the green transition. We're seeing the beginnings of the use of industrial policy for certain types of services. And also sort of the instruments that are used for the pursuit of industrial policy are actually quite varied. You'll see this a lot when Gordon speaks about place-based policies. A lot of it takes the form of fiscal incentives or subsidies. That's for economists, that's actually things that are generally, relatively easy to measure. But actually, a lot of industrial policy takes the form of other kinds of public supports or public interventions, and that could range all the way from sort of public attention to the problems of particular sectors at the expense of other sectors that don't get that attention in terms of solving the problems of particular sectors, to the provision of highly specific public inputs, where particular logistic needs, particular infrastructure needs, particular workforce needs. So many of these general horizontal policies that governments or economists think of as not being industrial policy because they're supposed to be horizontal and not discriminating across different kinds of economic activity, in practice are, because when you're putting a certain port in a place, you're deciding where that place is going to be, you're benefiting some activities as opposed to other. When you're deciding on investing in workforce training for IT or a particular manufacturing sector, that's a particular a policy that's going to help certain sectors but not others. There's always some degree of conditionality when you're talking about industrial policy. That's another area where I've recently written a paper with Mariana Mazzucato at UCL in the UK, and that's sort of a whole different discussion about, and conditionality could be essentially of a very hard type. That is that we're going to give you this incentive if you do X, where X is quantified, and if X is not fulfilled, we take it back or we penalize you. Or it could be soft, which is in fact much more common, which is there's a sort of an implicit understanding of certain behavioral changes that the recipients of the benefits will have to undertake. And there's a kind of iterative behavior, iterative process, whereby the government agencies are looking at whether, in fact, there is good faith effort on the part of the recipients to undertake those behavioral changes without necessarily having very strict quantitative requirements. And that would be more like a soft conditionality. Now, from an economic, conceptual, and theoretical standpoint, there's actually no shortage of good arguments, good rationale for the use of industrial policy. I would sort of categorize them under three headings. One is various technological and other kind of spillovers or learning externalities that creates market failures that provides an argument for government support for those sectors or firms or activities that provide those spillovers. Second is broadly coordination failures. Coordination failures typically require some increasing returns to scale and some non-tradability in the activities, so that you can have, either because of demands, complementary demand relationship, demand spillovers, or input-output linkages, you might have the failure of activities to take off simply because complementary activities or other activities in the network or in the input-output chain do not exist. But there might be an argument for the government to push to make those linkages take place through by essentially pushing those investments to take place. And third, I would say there's a kind of argument about sort of missing public inputs, where again, we often think about particular types of governments in terms of providing public goods, infrastructure, regulation, and so forth, or education as being as essentially horizontal interventions. But actually, for reasons I've already mentioned, governments have to make often sectoral or activity choices when they're making those apparently horizontal decisions, and therefore there's an element of selection that goes in, and therefore the provision of public inputs also creates a rationale for the use of industrial policy. Okay, now I don't need to tell you that most economists don't hold industrial policy in high regard. So we're holding this discussion. 3 years ago or 4 years ago, maybe the number of the people here would be even, sort of half of what it is now. But but the interesting thing I think is that the discussion among economists or sort of policy-oriented economists about industrial policy, or the negative focus, really arises from practical or pragmatic arguments. It's not really about sort of the conceptual or the theoretical rationale I've just discussed. It's really essentially two kinds of practical objections. One is that governments can never have the right information. So it's an informational argument. And so you'll often hear the counter argument that governments cannot pick winners. So it's really an argument about lack of information. The second argument is really about political economy. It's about politics, that even if governments in principle had the information required to assist the correct sectors, that once the government is in the business of providing or making choices about which types of firms or industries to help, that inevitably is going to turn the government to a tool of private interests, and that there will be rent-seeking and political influence that's going to distort the use of industrial policy. So essentially, the debate on industrial policy, for as long as I have been a researcher, has never been around the theoretical merits of industrial policy. It's always been around sort of very sharply conflicting views regarding the relative importance and pervasiveness of these pragmatic or practical objections to industrial policy, with sort of one side essentially saying, yeah, maybe East Asian governments did it, but look at really how difficult it is, and others won't be able to do it because East Asia was a very special case. And others saying, well, if East Asia could do it, maybe we can too. Let's try to learn. Okay, so let me just proceed by, by describing a very simple framework where maybe we can make a little bit more headway with sort of how evidence can help us here. So this is a very general framework where I have a sort of a kind of a measure of an indicator of economic performance, G. That could be TFP, it could be exports, whatever you care about. That's going to be a function of a bunch of things. One is government's actual policy, which is S. Think about a subsidy, the sort of generic industrial policy level of government intervention. It's a function of theta, which is theta is the parameter capturing the presence and magnitude of a market failure. So the idea is that S can actually countervail the market failure, and you can see the way that this enters here is that the effect of the market failure can be undone by using a subsidy of a relevant magnitude. A here is a kind of some underlying latent measure of performance. You can think about technology for a kind of a long-term growth equation, for example. And phi is capturing the capacity, the overall capacity of the government, or incapacity rather. The weaker the government, the higher phi, and therefore the more costly the use of the subsidy is going to be. Alpha is just a convex function, which, think about it, for example, the tax revenue that is needed to pay for the subsidy, and that would be kind of a convex function of the rate of subsidy. So government essentially solves an optimization problem that takes into account both the economic performance, G, but also might have a political motive, and think about pi as sort of the political motive, some concave function of the government intervention, S, and lambda is just the relative weight placed by the government on economic performance over political motives, right? So this is therefore is perfectly general. That sort of has a government that could care both for economic motives, it would care for political motives, could also can be hampered by its capacity, its lack of capacity. So ultimately, we want to distinguish empirically between three types of governments, right? So what is it that we're seeing? One type of government is what you might call, from the description of the East Asian experience, a developmental government. So a developmental government wants to maximize performance, economic performance, can actually identify where these market failures are, and has high capacity. Okay? An ineffective government would be one that is well-meaning, that doesn't put a large weight on the political motive, but has low capacity. And a corrupt government, right, would be one which targets intervention not on where these market failures are, but where the political motives matter. So ideally, we want empirical evidence to be able to discriminate amongst these, at least these three kinds of possibilities. Now, the problem from an empirical standpoint is that we don't observe the key critical parameters. We don't observe theta, which is these market failure parameters, which will differ across our units of observation. We don't observe the degree of capacity of the government. We don't observe how much weight the government puts on the political motive, right? And what we observe is simply, essentially, this measure of outcomes and our level of government intervention, S, okay? Now, the problem, of course, is that there's this correlation between S and G across, whether across sets of firms, across regions, across sectors, will actually not adequately distinguish among these three views of the government. In particular, the developmental and corrupt government are going to be observationally equivalent in having a cross-sectional correlation between G and S, which is negative. Now, in the case of the corrupt government, it might be easy to see why the correlation is going to be negative. But actually, why it is negative, even in the case of the developmental government, is for second best reasons. Remember that there is a kind of a cost to using the subsidy, so it will never be optimal for the government to fully offset the externality or the market failure. So cross-sectionally, you will still get, even if the government is behaving optimally, cross-sectionally, you will get a negative relationship between the government intervention and performance across treated units. So you might say, okay, this is a standard identification problem. And the way that we would do it is by trying to solve this using some source of exogenous variation in the use of government, so in G. So we can try to extract some random component of the policy. We can rely on IV, we can rely on historical or other kinds of accidents, right, to get at this. But the problem here is that in the case of industrial policy, this problem doesn't go away. It doesn't go away in a specific way, which is that imagine you did the perfect randomization, or imagine you had the perfect IV, and you got at causal identification. Now, what is it that you're doing? You're actually looking at the consequence of some random intervention by design on outcomes, okay? And that's not going to convince the skeptics on either side, because suppose that you do this and you get a positive result. What do I mean? That random interventions actually had positive effects on outcomes, right? Well, the skeptic of industrial policy is going to say, well, this doesn't in practice. The whole problem with industrial policy is that it's not going to be random. It's going to be used for politically bad ends. And that's the whole problem. That's my whole objection to industrial policy. So this doesn't speak to my concern at all. Alternatively, suppose you get a negative result, which is that a random sort of essentially a random application of industrial policy gets you a kind of a negative effects on performance, then the proponent of industrial policy is going to say, well, you know, how is this informative at all? Because I'm not suggesting the use of random industrial policy. I'm just suggesting the use of industrial policy that's actually targeting, you know, the appropriate sectors. So once again, it's not going to be particularly help resolve this debate. So this is central, I think, difficulty of causal inference for industrial policy, when industrial policy is not random or exogenous, but precisely responds to economic and political goals that cannot be directly observed. And the whole debate is about that relationship. It's not about the effect of random assignment of policy. So, there's a deep sense, therefore, in which that we can't really learn, in some sense, whether industrial policy works or not. That doesn't mean that we actually don't learn from empirical evidence, but we have to cut it somewhat differently. So what we can learn about, I think, is that we can learn about different aspects or different layers of the argument that goes into industrial policy. And in particular, we can learn about two sub-parts of the question. One part is, do the type of externalities on which industrial policy focuses really exist? And the second part, again, government policy really affect the structure of economic activity, regardless of whether it's ultimately well targeted on market failures or externalities or not. So I don't have time, but sort of sort of like a typical paper in the first literature would be sort of like the use of some historical or geographical accidents that created conditions that were sort of similar to the use of industrial policy. For example, a trade blockade. So the paper by Duhas focuses on the Napoleonic trade blockade on imports into France, and says that that creates a condition as if you were engaged in import substituting industrialization, and shows that there are sort of longer term effects on economic structure. Here, there's been a series of studies that have looked at sort of this. Now goes sort of more into the kinds of topics that Gordon is going to speak about, which are sort of a bunch of regional policies in the UK and Italy that have looked at either through IV or diff and diff or sort of exploiting various discontinuities, looking at the effect of whether actual, sort of use of subsidies, regional subsidies in most, have had positive employment and investment effects. But they really don't speak about whether the targeting was well done, but speak on the issue of whether you can actually affect economic activity. And this is where I'm going to leave it because I'm going over time. I think this newer evidence is really quite different from the older, much more correlational or case study-based evidence on industrial policy that sort of suggests that when you put these different elements together, that what emerges is a somewhat more positive view on the possibilities of industrial policy, both in terms of the evidence of these sort of learning implied longer-term structural consequences of policies, of various kinds of shocks, as well as the evidence on sort of the narrow effectiveness of industrial policies to affect the structure of economic activity. So let me just stop here and turn it over to Gordon.
Thank you, Danny. So what I'm going to talk to you about is a project that Danny and I started 2 years ago. In one part of which is trying to understand the nature of place-based policy in the United States. So this is a conference on development economics. Why are we talking about the US? Two reasons. One is, as we've discovered, the practice of development economics is alive and well in the United States, though economists often don't recognize it as such. If you look at efforts to help small firms, to target investment in low-income areas, to resolve all sorts of problems that we constructively think are being addressed in developing economy settings. Regional government's been doing this in the US for decades. As Danny mentioned with industrial policy, there is sort of a prior on the part of a lot of economists that industrial policy must be bad. There's also been a prior that, well, place-based policy must be bad too. And so part of our work is just to take a step back, as Danny has done in work on industrial policy, is just to say, okay, let's try and check some of our priors at the door and figure out what's actually going on. And that's what we're trying to do in this work. And we're in initial stages. So I'm going to give you, try and tantalize you with some preliminary results and tell you where we're going. So like industrial policy, place-based policy has made something of a comeback. This was true even before President Biden came in and just kind of blew the doors off of everything by pumping massive amounts of money into the US economy through the Build Back Better program, through the Inflation Reduction Act, which is not about inflation, it's about subsidies to address climate change, and now the CHIPS Act, which are subsidies for the semiconductor industry. So when I'll give you a more formal definition in just a second. When we talk about place-based policy, we're talking about now addressing a related set of distortions that crop up in the industrial policy domain, and that is regions that get stuck in a bad way. And the theoretical rationale for this are models that have spillovers and compensating differentials of different types, in which regions can get stuck in a low wage, low employment equilibrium. And there's a clear theoretical rationale to do something about that. The policies that are deployed are combinations of investment promotion. And when we think about place-based policy, that's usually where our analysis and our knowledge stops. As I'm going to suggest to you, consistent with what Danny was saying about industrial policy, place-based policy is about a lot more than that. It's about skill acquisition, it's about land redevelopment, and importantly, it is thinking about how you coordinate across policy domains to achieve the sort of complementarity that's needed to address the problems that distressed regions face. What's the goal here? The goal is to try and move regions out of that bad equilibrium. So that means upgrading economic structure. This often comes in response to a really bad set of economic shocks, which mean that the thing you used to export could be manufacturing, could be mining, could be tourism, could be something else. You're not competitive at that anymore. The world has changed and you've got to find something new. That finding something new can be tough. And that's often not the only thing that place-based policy is used for, but it's often what it's used for. And the goal then is to try and raise worker productivity, create better jobs, and address the sort of distortions that we've been talking about in economic geography forever, but we don't kind of embrace on the policy side as much. So as Danny kind of suggested, with what's happening right now is there's all of this experimentation. The academy got out of place-based policy about 25 years ago. So it's just not taught very often in universities today. It's offered here and there. And so what's happened is people are making it up on their own. They're forming their own associations, they're developing concepts of best practice, they're doing stuff. And we've just kind of ignored it as economists, except in some specific areas that I'll talk about. So as motivation, kind of, what are we talking about when we think about distressed economic regions? Let me show you work that's just kind of very related to stuff I've been doing regarding the long-term consequences of the China trade shock. This is the fraction of prime-age men without a college degree, so 25 to 54-year-old men without a college degree who are not working. Non-employment among this group is a sufficient statistic for economic distress. And there's a very nice AER paper by Amior and Manning that kind of fleshes that out. This is what things looked like in 1990. 30 years later, it looks a lot worse. So what do we find? We've got a bunch of places in the US, and not just in the US. We see this in Europe, and we're increasingly seeing it in middle-income countries that are having a hard time moving on from the thing they used to be doing. That transition is not felt equally across the economies of these places. There are some groups that are hit particularly hard. In the US, those are less educated workers. Here's what those non-employment rates look like for prime-age males with a college degree. It's like they live in a different country. And so this is evidence of policy failures of some kind, of distortions of some kind. We've got something that's getting in the way of resource allocation. Okay, so what are our policy options here? One is let markets do their thing. We don't have the information. We worry about political economy. Let market forces work. But what we know is that places can get stuck in these bad equilibrium for a long time. The standard approach, following kind of the Dixit principle of targeting, is forget about places. Places aren't the issue. What we're trying to do is raise people's income levels. So let's target policies on individuals who are hurting and try and move the margin for the people whose livelihoods we directly want to affect. The problem here is that when it comes to changing outcomes at the regional level, the social safety net doesn't seem to do much. And we, as a consequence, place effects are real. There are places where if you move there, your life outcomes will worsen. That has nothing to do with you. It has to do with the place. So, okay, that because of all of this, economists are now kind of reconsidering place-based policy. The best example of this come from a pair of papers by Ed Glazer, our colleague, which we can lightly poke fun at. 2008, Brookings papers, Ed says, place-based policy, disaster of an idea. All you're going to do is move agglomeration from here to there. It's not going to do anything. 2016, well, maybe we want to take another look. And what Ed was motivated by was this picture that we've got where places have gotten stuck with low employment rates, and we've got to figure out what to do. But like with industrial policy, there are a bunch of challenges here. There's no guarantee we're going to get it right. There's risk of capture by large firms. There's the fact that the policy effects might just all go to landowners. Even if policy is successful, and there's the ever-ready concern about policymakers not being sufficiently informed. Okay, so like with industrial policy, Danny, Nathan, and Rika define it based on intention. We're going to do the same thing with place-based policy. That is, policies that are intended to expand investment, raise productivity, upgrade economic structures in places that are distressed, and that means that have these markers of underutilization of resources. There are a bunch of other policies that are effectively, but not intentionally, place-based. Social safety net, just because poor people are concentrated in particular places. Income taxes that have nominally defined brackets, because cost of living varies across place, they're place-based. And of course, any sort of infrastructure investment is lumpy. It's going to go one place and not another. What we're doing in our project is not ignoring this stuff. We're going to be doing in part is to say, well, how does place-based policy look like relative to some of these other things? And we'll use the social safety net as sort of a benchmark, but we're also going to use the distribution of military bases, hospitals, and prisons. Prisons are a growth industry in the United States. They tend to generate lots of employment. And what types of policy resource flows are distressed places getting? Are they getting it through the safety net? Are they getting it through place-based policy proper? Are they getting it through some of these other flows? Okay, so we're going to try and do three things in this project. And this is before you ever get to evaluating impact effects. So we're starting on the positive side of asking the question, where does the money flow and what types of money flows to different places? And so this means building the policy of production chain. And I'll talk in just a second about why that's more complicated than it might seem. Then we want to map the resource flows across these different policy domains. In the European context, this is simplified by the fact that everything happens through a centralized cohesion funnel. In the US, it's a mess. We're in a Tocquevillian world in which everybody creates their own thing. Things are highly decentralized. And so tracking this stuff is a first order data lift. Then what we want to do is understand the role of state capacity in all of this. So I'll describe in just a second. The money is sitting there. It doesn't get directed to places. Places have to go out and get it. So it's not like a means-tested entitlement programs where the threshold for selecting into a program is pretty low. It's still not zero, it's low. Here it's different. Places with low state capacity, even though they meet all the criterion, nothing is going to automatically deliver that money to their doorstep. And so this highlights a difference in how place-based policy may operate across different national contexts. In some places, local state capacity is going to matter enormously for who gets what. In other places where things are more top-down, you may have the central government may place a bigger role. And we'll ultimately, not next year, but ultimately get to the point where we want to think about the operation of place-based policy in different national contexts. Okay, so the production chain. I want to give you two views of place-based policy. One is the canonical one that economists trot out to say, we shouldn't do it. We should, just like industrial policy, this is bad for our economic health. Sober economists don't engage in this sort of risky behavior. The Kansas City border war. So the city of Kansas City in the United States straddles two states, the state of Kansas and the state of Missouri. Economic developers, that is people who work for organizations that are rewarded, whose job is to go out and attract business to a place, they get rewarded for gross job creation. Not gross job creation. So if you're in Kansas City, what gross job creation do you count? Well, it depends on whether you work for the state of Missouri or the state of Kansas. If it's the state of Missouri, it's the Missouri side of the border. It's the state of Kansas, it's the Kansas side of the border. So policymakers on the two sides of the border started poaching businesses from each other. And over the course of a decade, they spent $300 million convincing business to go from one side of the border to the other side of the border, which by definition is zero sum. So economists will look at this and say, this is place-based policy. This is why we should never do it. Here's another view. Grand Rapids, Michigan, medium-sized town, Rochester, New York, kind of a slightly bigger town, each faced existential threats to their economies over the past couple of decades. Grand Rapids produces furniture. Furniture, if you had to think about China's comparative advantage, rank order it by industry, furniture's top three. You did not want to be a furniture producer in the last 3 decades because the import competition you're going to face is just overwhelming. Rochester's challenge was different. Their local champion was Kodak. Kodak made the bet that digital photography was a passing fad, and they went bankrupt. So each of these places had to figure out how to do something different in a global environment which had undermined their existing industrial base. And how did this work? Well, it worked because a bunch of local actors got together and figured out what sort of investments in human capital, in medium-sized business, in business attraction, and in infrastructure was needed to make things work. Central to this were these intermediary organizations. They were nonprofits, public-private partnerships. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, it was known as the Right Place. In Rochester was Greater Rochester Enterprise. So for development economists, the idea that nonprofits can come in and help bring positive change, you're comfortable with that. In the US, you're like, oh no, the nonprofits, they're gonna bring something woke, they're gonna be serving some special interest, or they're just gonna be too ineffectual. So here are cases in which these nonprofit actors played a central role in making stuff happen. Part of our goal in this project is to figure out how exceptional are Grand Rapids and Rochester. What are the factors that help give rise to the organizations in Grand Rapids and Rochester that allow these intermediaries to serve these effective institutions, to become these effective institutions? And are there lessons, are there policy blueprints that are then exportable to other places? Now, in doing this, we're like, oh, the economists, we're going to come discover all of this stuff. The economic development folks, they know all of this. So what we're trying to do is effectively mine their knowledge so that we understand what they're up to. So we've got kind of central to our understanding of the way that the policy production chain works is we've got money sitting there that the federal government puts in place. We've got money that state governments put in place, and they have all sorts of rules and procedures and application processes. And you're not going to get that money unless you've got the right intermediary organizations who pull that money out. And I'll briefly give you some examples of that. Okay, so part of this operation then requires us to engage in a bit of organizational behavior. And so we're trying to understand the types of organizations that are involved in this. Without going into a lot of detail, I'm going to give you examples of two types of organizations. One I just did, these places in Grand Rapids and Rochester, they are, you can think of these multi-purpose place-based policy-making organizations. They're trying to coordinate across different policy domains. They're trying to attract resources. They are strategizers and planners and orchestrators. They then work along with special purpose actors, some of which are completely government funded, some of which are not, who then are directly involved with carrying out place-based policy. And I'll give you a couple of examples of those. Okay, so I've got lots of detail here on place-based policy domains. I'll pick just a couple of things so you get a sense of what the stuff looks like. I want to start with the business attraction or business recruitment and retention, because this is what economists have spent most of their time focusing on. So you think of the Greenstone, Hornbeck, and Moretti $1 million plant paper, Kaylin Slattery's excellent work on places bidding for mega deals, Amazon getting every single city in the United States to spend oodles and oodles of dollars to go and try and lure it. That's what we have in mind. Parallel to this, workforce development, a second important area. And you might think of this as, well, let's just kind of subsidize worker training, you go get vouchers, that kind of thing. No. Well, how workforce, that happens in the US, it's trivial. It's $1.5 billion a year. $40 billion a year are being spent by community colleges on career and technical education. We have 1,400 of these, and these are the entities at the front lines of providing the skills that you need to transition from one thing or another. And I'll explain, and I'll give you some examples of what the career and technical education looks like. Third is subsidized investment that goes to low-income areas. This is kind of probably the area that gets the second most attention. These are enterprise zones, empowerment zones, President Trump's opportunity zones, and that you get this notion that this is where most of the money is being spent. No, the empowerment zones that Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama invested in, there was 184 of them over 20 years. They spent $2 billion. These are demonstration projects that we think of as this is the front lines of where things are going on. No, it's not. Where things are going on are as a set of tax breaks that go to specialized financial institutions that are one of these special purpose entities that your place has to have the wherewithal to create. And once you create it, you get access to $4 billion a year in tax breaks that you can then implement. But you got to have the wherewithal to bring one of these organizations into existence. And finally, small business development. And here's this really interesting dichotomy. We do RCTs in developing countries about how enhancing management skills has all these wonderful long-run impacts on companies. The US has been doing this for the Small Business Administration for 30 years. Through entities known as small business development centers. The overwhelming prior in both DC and among researchers is that, no, the SBA is this amazingly ineffective organization. What they're doing is the work that the Bloom, McKenzie et al. Showed us worked in India, and then the Iancavoni stuff in Colombia. They've been doing this all along, and we've never really evaluated. Now, there's a bunch of other stuff the Small Business Administration does in terms of subsidizing loans. Okay, so I want to leave ample time for questions. So I'm going to highlight just a few things for you. As we're going through this, what we're then trying to do is in each of these policy domains, say, who are the actors involved? How does the money, who provides the money, and how does the money get from the provider to the recipient? And in each of these domains, there's a set of rules and procedures and protocols. And as a consequence, there are a set of intermediary organizations that either mandate it into existence or arise endogenously to help that funding flow. The next thing we're going to do is then say, given that system, does the money go where it should? And let's go back to that map of variation in employment rates across place. First order thing we're trying to address, send money to places where joblessness is high. When we look at the social safety net, what do we see? Well, this is exactly where the social safety net money goes. And so this is food stamps, this is negative income taxes, this is kind of direct cash welfare, Medicaid payments to low-income households for subsidized healthcare. And I'll show you just examples of what this looks like for different place-based policy domains. A lot of it doesn't look anything like this. We've put money into the system, but because of the rules in place, you're biasing it towards places that have a high state capacity. But places are able to engineer their way around this, like Grand Rapids and Rochester, to make stuff happen in some cases, though not in the preponderance of them. Okay, business promotion. This isn't as big as you would think. Community colleges spend more on career and technical education than state governments spend on tax subsidies to companies. I did not know that. I thought tax subsidies to companies were going to be 3x career and technical subsidies, and they're not. Subsidies are a big deal. They're still $25 to $30 billion a year. What does their allocation look like? They do not go to places with high joblessness. They don't go to really rich places either. They go to places that are somewhere in between, and we've got lots of other results here. But what are these business tax incentives doing? They're kind of not going to places in need. Small business development, even worse. Small business development, because the Small Business Administration is by law mandated to break even every year, is prevented from engaging in the sort of redistribution that you'd want it to do. And so it ends up tracking the market and rather than helping the market. You need to get this money are so high, most communities don't have them. And so it ends up being close with a positive news about community colleges are this amazing institution in the United States, which heavily subsidizes career and technical education, mostly for good jobs, for people who are never going to get a four-year college degree. The problem is they are not responsive enough to changes in economic conditions. So resources, you do see more training when joblessness increases, but not nearly as much as you would want. You want the supply curve for career and technical education to be flat. People need it, they should get it. The supply curves are far from flat. This is giving you a flavor of part two. Part three is then putting this all together and understanding how the orchestration works, the nature of policy complementarities, and all of that. That's where we are. You think of place-based policy, it's way more than mega deals, than tax breaks for trophy firms. But the US has created a system that works against many places getting access to that funding. We've got some super intriguing experimentation that's going on that tells us how things might actually be able to work well. Thank you.
Yeah, question to Professor Rodrik about the role of economic bureaucracies in the successful implementation of industrial policy. I'm thinking here that the historical successful cases of industrial policy involved building a competent economic bureaucracy through attracting top calibers, giving them high incentives, a level of bureaucratic autonomy. So my question here is, in light of the fact that public sector jobs are not that attractive, I mean, how can you build competent public agencies that can champion the industrial policy that you're trying to implement?
Yeah, there's some recent work that actually goes very much in that direction, that looks at Korea's export promotion activities and finds that even within Korea, which we associate with a competent, that those officials that were more competent tend to be more effective in terms of promoting exports. So, we shouldn't be surprised that there is some link with bureaucratic competence. I mean, I think that this, and a lot of what Gordon was saying in this, it really goes beyond the capacity of individual bureaucrats. It's really about the nature of the bureaucratic or whoever is leading this effort, the quality of their interaction with the other stakeholders that need to be coordinated around this issue. So if you're running an export promotion program, it's just not, how many years of college you had or how many years of experience, but also what is the nature of your relationship with the relevant firms, and how well is that kind of interaction, and being able to, sort of build support and monitor and learn from, the private sector, groups that you're trying to motivate becomes very important. So on the one hand, I think you can see this as a huge obstacle, because as you say, this is not the capacity that we have. On the other, again, something that comes out from the US experience. So I love this, how much I'm learning about economic development in the rest of the world from the US. And I think, how many people know that there is a economic development organization in the United States that has nothing to do with what you guys are doing? What is it called? The International Economic Development Council. This is, this stuff has been going on in the US that for all my career, I thought I was a development economist. I had no idea that there was a sort of a parallel world that's addressing the same questions that developing countries are trying to engage in. And that's really, as Gordon highlighted, there's so much that we can learn from that. But sort of the specific learning is, in the developing world, where you lack capacity in one part, there's always another part of the government where you might have the capacity. So what Peter Evans, I think, was called about pockets of bureaucratic efficiency in the different governments. So an example of that, for example, is that central banks or long-term development banks tend to be much more competently run. They're much more, so that's why a lot of successful industrial policy gets run in the old days through the central bank or the long-term development banks when they used to exist, even though the instrument of choice wasn't necessarily lending, but it just happens to be that that's where you have the competence, and therefore it's better to assign an organization that has the competence to the problem, even though you're not using the first best instrument for the need at hand, because maybe what they need is not finance, they need something else. I think in the US, I think the kind of examples from Grand Rapids and Rochester that Gordon gave is that, it's not clear who's going to provide that coordination, right? In Grand Rapids, it turned out to be this German woman who, was sort of knew how sort of the local state policies in Germany worked. And then for whatever reason, she found herself in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and sort of ran this incredibly successful, cross-sectoral cooperative, sort of work, bringing everybody together. In somewhere else, it could be the Chamber of Commerce. It could be in someplace else. It might be the actually designated economic development agency. So there's a lot of opportunity for, just the US equivalent of pockets of efficiency to basically jump up and the opportunity. So that's part of, I think, what we're trying to understand also is this capacity is highly endogenous, and there are lots of ways in which it can be provided. It doesn't necessarily have to be, sort of the designated person or agency. You can have somebody else jump in and do it. And why you have some places this is happening and other places it's not happening, I think is the interesting question.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, you didn't talk that much about the kind of theoretical arguments in favor or against place-based policy. I was just wondering how that feeds into, so you have these kind of graphs of the amount of funding each places get with respect to their level of economic distress. What should we be thinking about what the optimal slope of that graph should be, and how does that relate to the different arguments in theory?
Really good question. So the framework that's useful for thinking about the theoretical rationale that is kind of the most innovative right now is this paper by Pablo Pajobam and Cecile Gobert, which they show that look, the longstanding critique about place-based policy is that you're just going to move an industry cluster from point A to point B, and you're not changing the nature of the equilibrium. That critique holds only under very special conditions. And once you're in a world which combines spillovers and compensating differentials, then you are really going to have places that get stuck. And on the margin, what do you want to be doing? You want to be redirecting resources to these low-wage places. So you asked what the optimal policy is. We want to ask a much less ambitious question. Is the direction of policy flows at all consistent with results of that type? Some of them just aren't. We're sending money to places that are doing pretty well. It's not doing that at all. So it's you can with pretty high confidence, you can say, we believe that model, this is not going to be right. But we're going to be moving towards trying to be clearer about that. And so if you can say, taking an existing environment in which we observe variation in employment rates or real wages like we see, what should be on the margin things that are welfare improving in terms of resource flows, and then compare what we actually see.
In terms of place-based policies, I was just wondering what you think about the trade-off between should we be supporting places that are lagging behind, or should we be promoting mobility so that people are actually moving towards where places are more productive, they're doing better. And I was wondering, do you think like the marginal dollar spent on first versus the second approach might be considered more or less useful?
So the full answer to your question is a long one. But the 30-second one is, we vastly overestimated the mobility of labor in response to economic conditions. And there's some very good reasons why we did that. We're doing the same thing in developing countries. The basic version is, if you make inferences about mobility of economies in transition, you're going to overestimate that mobility. And so in point of fact, it's just really hard to get people below the 75th percentile to move very far, even in response to really bad economic shocks. And so that's the let market forces work. It'll work. It'll probably take you 3 generations for it to play itself out.
I'll use my prerogative. I guess just a question to both of you. We've been talking a bit about sort of as younger researchers coming to these fields, what are trends, and you both kind of alluded to it. I'm wondering, what are tools that are useful in doing this kind of work? Danny alluded to sort of how difficult it's going to be. Traditional identification would work, and I know you and your projects have used large-scale micro-admin data. Is that something you think is going to be increasingly feasible in developing countries? Can we really have that level of granularity that kind of the regional or local-based kind of industrial policy version will be asking for? And also, are there additional tools that we should be deploying? I know we have different sessions going on. Some are AI, and some are sort of data science in these areas. Are there things you're seeing that will make this easier to do, or not?
Yeah, really glad you asked that question. As economists, our predilection is for creating fancier tools and to tell people that simple is just wrong, and you got to talk to me and I know how to do it. It comes to labor economics, what we learn is every generation of new tools, the simple thing works pretty well. When it comes to understanding wage variation across places, what David Card, Rothstein, and Yee in recent papers show, you can disentangle that into place effects, person effects, and industry effects. And we can study the place effects with data from IPUMs, with data from censuses. And if the policy interventions we're interested in are hitting regions, if that's the treatment unit, then we've got a lot of data available. And what we want to be doing is measuring the treatments, which we often gloss over because we're trying to go at very targeted interventions and get at identification in the narrow. And I think there are a lot of opportunities for identification in the semi-aggregate that are feasible and important.
No, I totally agree. I think getting a much better handle on varieties of policy, because we tend to sort of quantify those that sort of leave a mark on the government accounts, or we can actually measure well. But what really stands out in this field is it's not the importance of very specific measure like subsidies or import protection, but sort of the whole, the activities of coordination and collaboration and how different organizational resources are deployed. And as economists, we don't necessarily have a very good handle on how to measure this. But even descriptive work in this area, that's sort of where are organizational resources deployed relative to needs, for example. I think that is of first order importance. I think it just, I would like to see some more investment in there compared to the question of how can I carry out a well-identified study that just focuses on a particular instrument. I think we're running out of time, but maybe one last question or comments.
I just have a question to add another layer to this. So in terms of targeting, it seems that it's better, the more decentralized you get, the better you're able to target certain policies. At the same time, there are certain coordination failures that you can't solve unless a higher level of government is involved. There's this tension, or there's this lack of coordination as it is. And add to that the tension that's created when the same political actors are competing for credit, both at the national level and at the state level. So that's just one layer of complexity. Maybe it's not within the scope of your project, but I just thought of this, something that at least in India, we are seeing a lot. Political competition between the same stakeholders that are in power at the federal and the state level. At the same time, you can't have effective policies unless both sort of actors come together, because one has the capacity to solve larger coordination failures, and one has the capacity to target schemes in a more effective way.
I think that's a very good question. I think China has a lot of experience here that's going to be very relevant, because they've, sort of generally had a process whereby sort of any kind of major program is first rolled out from the center as a kind of a key priority, like EVs or batteries, and then you send it out to states, and then you might select a few as sort of pilot zones or experimentation, and then you let them do their thing. And some of it is going to be beneficial because you have new knowledge is being generated about how to do things. Some of it can go overboard because they end up being, sort of engaging in the kind of zero-sum behavior that Gordon was expecting. At some point, it kicks back up to the center, and the center is now going to say, now, okay, I'm going to consolidate this because it has gone. So you can see how this tends to work in China, not always very well, because sometimes they built a lot of overcapacity in certain areas, but they have a lot of experience precisely managing this and on the trade-off between the experimentation and some of the coordination issues. So thank you. I think it's time for